We begin tonight a study of the history of the church in the High Middle Ages, particularly in the year 1000, beginning about the year 1000, and continuing up to about 1500, with a special emphasis upon the 1000s, 1100s, and 1200s. About the year 1000, there were dramatic changes all throughout Europe that really provide a demarcation between the previous early Middle Ages and the civilization of the early Middle Ages and the civilization of the High Middle Ages. We did teach a series of studies that some in our audience here tonight were a part of, and we do offer that, and Getty Ministries does, as the early church history package. For those of you familiar with that material, I might mention that by way of review, and for those of you who are new to the study, that in the West, an institution called the papacy developed in the church that developed nowhere else. That one bishop in one church claimed that he had authority over the entire church and ultimately over the entire world. That is a phenomenon that will not happen elsewhere. For instance, it doesn't happen in the East, because there the view was that the emperor of the empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, was indeed the head of the church, and the church never challenged that. The highest church officials from the standpoint of the Eastern Church were patriarchs, and they considered that the Bishop of Rome was a patriarch, and he had no more authority than any other patriarch, of which there were 5. But in the West, where the authority of the Eastern Roman Empire was very weak, the Bishop of Rome began to take to himself considerable political authority as well as spiritual authority. And the result is the institution that was known as the papacy, whereby the Bishop of Rome claims that he is the supreme pontiff, the supreme ruler over the church and over the state. There were 3 great popes in the early Middle Ages. Out of all the popes of the early Middle Ages, only 3 that really need our attention. 1, Leo I in the 5th century. Leo came to power just a few years before the last Roman emperor in the West was deposed in 476. He came to power in the 440s. And around 450, 451, along in there, Leo will claim that he is the Pope. And he is the first Bishop of Rome to make that claim. He made it in the absence of any real authority of the Eastern Church. The emperor had no authority, and obviously the Western emperor, who finally the last one was but a 12-year-old boy, was very weak and ineffective in the face of the incoming German tribes. And so in that vacuum that's created of both spiritual and political authority, Leo moved. And Leo claimed that he was indeed the father, the pope of the entire church. His scriptural basis of that claim was Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, where Jesus said to the apostle Peter, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And the assumption that Leo made, which we call the Petrine thesis, is that Jesus meant that Peter would be the head of the church, and the church would be built upon Peter, and Peter would have the power of binding and loosing, which meant the power of ruling and making laws for the church. And the second assumption was that Peter was the first bishop of Rome. And the third assumption was that whoever the second bishop of Rome was, and the third and the fourth, and on down until the Lord comes again, would have the same authority that Peter had, minus the authority of being an apostle and revealing the word, as the apostles had that particular job. But other than that, the jurisdictional authority that apostles had to guide the church would belong to the bishops, and the Bishop of Rome would have the jurisdictional authority that Peter had. And he was the Bishop of Rome, and so he claimed that authority for himself. The second great pope of the early Middle Ages was Pope Gregory, the one who authored the Gregorian chants, or at least collected them. He ruled between 590 and 604. He was a very humble man who did not like being called pope and did not like the majesty and the honor that was attributed to that office. He was a very Christ-like figure, but he was a very capable figure, and so capable was he in the absence of political authority that he strengthened the papacy mightily and left it much stronger. He also changed the theological emphasis from where St. Augustine left it, that we are saved by grace, to place an emphasis upon works, particularly the sacrament of penance, whereby one does something to obtain forgiveness of temporal sin. And that set a direction in the church. The influence of Gregory is enormous on the church and on its formation, the Roman church, at this time. There was an event that will take place between the second and third great popes of the early Middle Ages. It's called the donation of Pepin. Pepin was a French duke. It happens that a Germanic tribe called Lombards had invaded Italy. They had taken Ravenna, which was the old western capital, and had been the Byzantine western capital. They took Ravenna and moved straight on Rome. The Pope, who happened to be at that time a man named Stephen, he's not important as an individual, but he did call upon this duke in France by the name of Pepin to come and deliver him, and Pepin did drive out the Lombards. Whereupon the Pope made Pepin the first Carolingian king of France. His son was the famous Charlemagne. Then Pepin turned around and gave the land out of which he had driven the Lombards to the Pope. And that land, stretching from Ravenna southward to Rome, is like a belt across Italy. And it's a huge amount of Italy. That now became the personal possession of the Pope. That meant the Pope was a landlord. That meant the Pope would have to defend his lands. And land was power, and land was wealth in the Middle Ages. It now put the Pope in a very good position of jockeying for political power. The third great pope of the early Middle Ages is Nicholas I, 856 to 867. Nicholas now advanced fully the idea that the Pope is not only the supreme power in the church, and that all Christians in the world are obligated to be under the authority of the Pope, but the Pope is the supreme political power. That the church rules over the state, that the Pope will rule over kings and emperors, that the power of the religious will rule over the power of the secular. Now, he was very explicit about that. And he forced a man wearing the title of emperor, in fact the grandson of Charlemagne, to submit to that claim. He could not, however, get the Eastern Church to submit to that claim. And the Patriarch of Constantinople, a man named Photius, refused that. However, Nicholas is now making that claim and making great strides toward implementing the claim that the Pope will be the supreme political power in all of Europe. But after Nicholas died in 867, after a temporary rupture between the East and West churches, they got back together subsequently, for one reason, because the popes who followed were weak. Now, in the matter of appointing popes, bishops of Rome, there was no definite method, and it had kind of defaulted to the Roman Senate. Once the Roman Senate had become Christians, because the Senate held power throughout the days of the Roman Empire, and because the Roman Senate had originally had some power in appointing people to offices, it devolved upon the Roman Senate to appoint the popes. And so for the rest of that century, a Roman senator by the name of Theophylact was very powerful, and he appointed his select men, who were all very weak, enabling him to be the real power, and his family to be the real power until the end of that century. After that, we see the rise of a German empire under Otto I. The Germans actually put together an empire and coronated an emperor in 962. The Germans then wrested the power of papal selection away from the Roman Senate and began to appoint the popes themselves. They had a deliberate policy of appointing the most immoral popes they could, the most incompetent popes. And they did that for a purpose. There was a method in their madness. If a man is a pope who is entirely incompetent, if he is so involved in the lusts of the flesh that he is in pursuit of his own physical pleasure all the time, he will have no time or energy to devote to his job as Pope. That's good for the German Emperor, because then he can run the show. He's not going to have any competition. He's not going to have any Pope who is going to try to assert the power of the papacy as did Nicholas. That's why some historians, some church historians, have called that dismal period in the history of the church the pornocracy. Now that situation continues throughout the 10th and half of the 11th century. And then something happens in the 11th century that is remarkable. But before we come to that, I want to back up and mention just a couple of things of interest. I think they should be of interest to us. Not all the popes during that period of time were of that nature, and most of them were. But for some very interesting reason, we're going to have at least one clear exception to that, a scholar who in fact was appointed by a German emperor, but his name was Gerbert of Aurillach. He was anything but immoral. He was a decent, God-fearing, Christ-like individual, and he was a great scholar. He was a great scientist, a great mathematician. He knew philosophy, a great historian. He was one of the greatest scholars of the 10th century, Gerbert of Aurillach. And he became Pope as Pope Sylvester II. As a matter of fact, he was such a good scholar and so competent that he nearly got removed from office, because that's not what the emperors wanted, although the emperor did appoint him to this office, but there were even those in the church who found him too good and would like to see him removed, and were used to the weaker ones, because you see, if a weak pope is in there, that really means more strength and more power for the lesser clergy. At any rate, for whatever reason, Gerbert had his problems with the church. He had a glorious scheme to try to reunite the East and West empires. Now that the German Empire had come along, he planned to reunite with the East, and he was working with Otto's grandson. Otto's grandson was half Byzantine, because Otto I had arranged a marriage between his son, Otto II, and the daughter of the Byzantine emperor, the Eastern Roman emperor. Hence, Otto III, who was born of that union, was half Byzantine. He had grandparents on both sides of his family who were emperors. One grandparent who was a Byzantine emperor, and one grandparent who was a German emperor. And so a very logical person to be the emperor, the new emperor of a combined German and Byzantine empire. And here is Gerbert in the middle of this trying to orchestrate these events. But unfortunately, both Gerbert and Otto III died within a year of each other, 1002 and 1003, and nothing came of it. During that period of time as well, the truce of God and the peace of God were instituted by some of the leaders in the church who wanted to see a little more spirituality. This is a good side, a good point to make. The truce of God and the peace of God allowed that there would be no fighting from Wednesday night until Sunday morning. And then there would also be no fighting on church property, because you see these knights just love to fight all the time. And this was designed to bring a little more Christian-like behavior to people. And one other thing to mention before we come to this pivotal 11th century, and that is in 910, in France, in a little town in France called Cluny, a monastery was established. And out of that monastery, many other monasteries were established that were of the Cluny order. The Cluny monastery was, from the beginning, established with the idea of reform. The people who established it, the abbot of Cluny, and those who were educated there, became an educational institution, and people went there to study. And they knew this was a reforming monastic order, and they would go study, and they were very academic. They were committed to doing away with the abuses and the corruption in the church. For instance, it was customary, and it didn't stop with the Cluny movement, unfortunately, we see it continuing, but it was customary for someone to buy his office. That was called simony. Remind you of Simon the sorcerer, who tried to buy the gift of the Holy Spirit from the apostles. And so people often would buy their church office because they could take the revenues of that office and because it gave them power. And now the Cluny movement was committed to trying to do away with simony. Also, people oftentimes were unfaithful to their vows. Monks and nuns and priests were getting married. They had taken a vow to remain celibate. That was considered to be unfaithful to your vows. Forced celibacy. Monasteries were not enforcing their discipline, their order. So what Pliny was trying to do is purify the church and restore to the church discipline and order. They were very serious about it, and they educated people with that in mind. And this movement spread rapidly. So it's a great reform movement within the church at this time. We think reform, we think of the Reformation during the 16th century, but I would like to remind you that reform within Christianity is an ongoing process. That it is built into the very nature of true Christianity. That Christians are continually looking for ways to reform and to be more Christ-like. And that's what we would expect if we're guided by the Holy Spirit. So this movement began, and there will come out of that movement 4 significant leaders. Now, as I go through tonight describing what these leaders did, there's much of it that will sound appalling as we say, but wait, these people are taking over and ruling the world, and there is no question about the fact they're doing that. And I'm not trying to gloss over that. On the other hand, understand this. On the good side, these people are committed to trying to get the church on a more spiritual basis and a more disciplined basis. There is that motivation as well. And as we've gone through these studies in church history, I've tried to suggest to you, rather than looking at a practice and saying, oh, that's just totally wrong, let's just condemn that, I've tried to suggest, let's try to understand why people did what they did and try to see the good that does come out of these things. And that's what I'll try to do tonight with this. There were 4 people involved that became great leaders. I call them the 4 horsemen, but that's from the book of Revelation, you know. Just a little about each of them. First of all, there was Peter Damian. Now, they were associated with Cluny. They didn't always agree with each other, but in one way or another, all 4 of them were very instrumental in the dramatic change that takes place within the papacy. Peter Damian, first of all. Peter Damian was a great preacher. He's one of the greatest preachers of all time. This man had a tremendous gift for communicating. He was powerful. He was a type of preacher that would keep you spellbound when you heard him speak. He could convince people. Now, you put the message of reform in a heart that believes in reform with the ability to proclaim it as Peter Damian had, and there's a powerful instrument for God for reforming the church. The second person was a man named Humbert. Humbert was a great diplomat. He knew how to work with people. He knew how to negotiate with people. He knew how to get what he wanted with people. Again, if he's dedicated to an idea, he's going to go after that idea, and he's going to be very effective with it. A third man was a nobleman, Bruno of Jewel. He was a great administrator. He was a great leader. He had the connections, and he became Pope. He was Pope Leo the Ninth. And it is when Bruno became Pope that these 4 men gained control of the papacy. After a long struggle, they finally gained control of the papacy, and they began to implement their program. Now, the 4th person to mention to you is a man named Hildebrand. Hildebrand was a mastermind. He was the man behind the scenes, the man who for 25 years doesn't step up front to actually become leader, and when he does, he has a program and he's ready to go into action. These 4 horsemen are the people who changed the whole papacy, took it out of the hands of the German emperor, did away with popes who were immoral and incompetent, and made the papacy and the church significant. Do I personally approve of the political machinations and power that's manifested as a Christian who looks at Scripture and what Jesus had to say on that subject? No. But understand at the same time, they see themselves as rescuing the church from a very ugly, unpleasant situation. When these 4 men came to power in 1054, one of the first things they did is to settle the score with the Eastern Church. If this church is going to be united, and they saw that, and believed in their hearts that there was one church, and they believed that it was the Roman Church, and they believed that the Pope should be the head of the church, how could they convince people in the West? How could they convince kings and emperors in the West to submit to this church, to a truly Christian society as they envisioned it, while the Eastern Church is refusing to do so? You have half of Christendom, half of the church, that is saying, we don't believe that the Bishop of Rome is the ultimate authority. They could not afford to let that go on. And so a showdown had to come once and for all. Therefore, they organized themselves very carefully. And of course, it was Humbert that they picked to go to Constantinople, to the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and to speak there to the Patriarch of Constantinople. Now, the bad thing for these four horsemen is they chose a bad time. They should have chosen a time when there was a very weak and incompetent patriarch in Constantinople. They happened to pick the best. They happened to pick the most competent patriarch of Constantinople that the Eastern Church probably ever produced, a man by the name of Michael Cerularius, who was building himself a position of power within the Byzantine Empire. And he was not about to turn it over to the Bishop of Rome. And so when Humbert went to Constantinople and told Cerularius that he and the emperor must submit to the authority of the Pontiff of Rome, Cerularius told him what he could do with that. He told him, in no uncertain terms, no. Therefore, Cardinal Humbert took an order of excommunication, which he brought with him just in case. He rather knew that his diplomatic skills might not be enough. And he went into the church of Hagia Sophia, one of the most beautiful churches ever built, the capital church of Eastern Orthodoxy. This church is still there. It's not used as a church today because the Turks control Istanbul. But he went into Hagia Sophia and he laid this excommunication order upon the altar of Hagia Sophia. And it said that the Pope hereby delivers the entire Eastern Communion to the devil. In other words, you submit to the authority of Rome, or Rome condemns you to hell. And that's the situation that has officially obtained ever since 1054 when that happened. Although there have been many overtures lately of these two churches maybe getting back together, a millennium has passed, and they still remain two separate churches. There was yet another problem that needed to be addressed, and that was the problem of how we select popes. Well, the Roman Senate once did, then the German emperors did. So these four men now come up with a new Roman Senate. They called it the Curia. That was the old Latin word for Senate. The Senate was the Curia. So they create a new Curia. And this Curia will now be responsible for naming the popes. But the members of this Curia are not the nobility of Rome. They are people appointed by the Pope, and they create a new office called cardinal. And like the bird, wears red, wears a red hat. And the cardinals appoint the Pope. And that took the election process away from the German emperors, and that's the way it's been ever since. Popes appoint cardinals, cardinals appoint popes. Then, in 1073, Hildebrand finally became pope, and he took the papal name of Gregory VII. He was pope until 1085. A practical, moral man. He came up from the bottom. He was the son of an Italian peasant of German background. He was not well educated, but he was smart. And the first thing he did was to issue, one of the first things he did was to issue what he called the Dictatus Papae, the edict of the Pope. And he set forth his beliefs, his policy. And first of all, he said the Roman Church has never erred and never can err. The Roman Church has never made a mistake and never will make a mistake. That's the doctrine of the infallibility of the Church, and they mean by that the infallibility of the Roman Church. The Pope is the supreme judge of everything. He may be judged by no one. There's no one above him. And there is no appeal from his judgment. Once you've got a judgment from the Pope, you cannot appeal any higher than the Pope. No synod of the Church can be considered a general one, a binding one, unless he has ordered it to be so. The Pope may depose, transfer, or reinstate a bishop. He alone is entitled to the homage of all princes. He is the only person in the world that rightfully can be served, pledged allegiance to, submitted to by all princes of the world. And he alone may depose an emperor. Did this fly well? Did he succeed in this? Absolutely not. It ignited a tremendous controversy that we will look at in our next study. A tremendous controversy. First, the investiture controversy, but it was only one of a series of basic controversies between church and state. But now the papacy is established as a papal monarchy, with the idea of producing unity, with the idea of bringing into reality a Christian community, a Christendom, a Christian kingdom on earth. There were other popes who were great popes. Urban II, who called the First Crusade. We'll talk about the Crusades in a subsequent study. Pascal II, who was very Christ-like, who would not even wear the title of Pope and be called by all of these names of honor, and gave up all his wealth to live like Christ. The greatest Pope, though, of the High Middle Ages was Innocent III. At the end of the 12th, 1198 to 1216. He comes closest to any Pope of creating a situation what we would call universal sovereignty. That is, of the Pope being the sovereign on earth, the supreme power on earth. He restored papal lands. He preached 2 crusades. He controlled kings and emperors. He brought the Emperor Frederick II to the throne of Germany. He excommunicated the most powerful French king in the Middle Ages, Philip II. He forced King John of England to surrender the entire nation of England to the papacy. He will authorize the new orders of the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and he called the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 as the great triumph of his reign, that rubber-stamped everything that he asked for. 400 bishops, 800 abbots and priors attended. And at the Fourth Lateran, at the very height of papal power, Innocent defined that the church is one and universal. He defined that the sacraments are channels of grace. Yes, we're saved by grace, but we're saved through the channels of the sacraments. That's the way grace comes to us, is through sacraments, which of course are administered by priests. The doctrine of transubstantiation was defined, that communion elements are literally the body and blood of Christ. Rules of annual confession, annual penance, annual communion, rules for election of bishops, qualifications of clergy, education in each cathedral, theological instruction. He authorized a crusade to deal with the heretics in the south of France, the Albigensian Cathars. Trial by battle and ordeals were forbidden. Relics were regulated. Rigorous monastic rules were instituted. And so here at this point, we see Innocent as virtually the Lord of all the earth, at least in the western part, Western Europe. Still not accepted in the East. And the last pope to mention, I'm going to take out 3 of these, as we had 3 great early medieval popes, 3 great high medieval popes, Gregory VII, Innocent III, and Boniface VIII, 1294 to 1303. We'll be talking more about these people as time goes on, but Boniface VIII was a very rude, vulgar individual who probably was not even a believer. He was a disgrace to his office. He came to power saying, "I am Pope, I am Caesar," wearing imperial robes. He kept very low company, and his mismanagement of his office and his failure to discern what was going on brought the papal monarchy crashing down. Were there good motives? Yes. Was there good established from all of this? If you look at the whole picture, yes. Was there much sin and evil in it? Yes. It's a fascinating story, and we'll continue that in our next study.